Our daughter is a thief, and we have proof. My father Richard stood at the head of the Thanksgiving table and declared it in front of 30 of our relatives. The room instantly fell into a deathly silence. You could have heard a pin drop. The smell of roast turkey and sweet potato pie suddenly made me feel sick. My father reached into his carefully tailored suit jacket, pulled out a folded legal document, and slid it across the table. It skimmed past a dish of cranberry sauce and stopped right beside my plate. A court summons. My mother Diane sat beside him, looking at me with a blend of fake pity and total triumph. My younger brother Jason and his wife Maya smirked from the far end of the dining room, expensive wine glasses in their hands. I didn't gasp in shock. I didn't shed a single tear. I didn't beg them to stop staring at me. I simply lifted my wine glass, took a slow, elegant sip of red wine, and smiled. Then I reached into my own leather handbag, pulled out a thick brown envelope, and slammed it down on the table with a loud thud. What a coincidence, I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm as I looked straight into my father's eyes. I have proof, too. Before I tell you exactly what was inside that thick envelope, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from. And hit like and subscribe if you've ever had to stand up and protect yourself from people who call themselves family but only ever wanted to destroy you. My name is Caroline. I'm 55 years old. I work as a forensic audit director investigating complex financial fraud cases for a major corporation in Chicago. I spend my days tracing hidden assets, offshore bank accounts, and people who embezzle company money. But to my family, I was never seen as a successful professional. I was just the quiet, unmarried daughter they thought they could manipulate and bleed dry whenever they needed cash. If you've ever been treated like an ATM by the very people who share your blood just because you chose a life without a husband or children, then you'll want to hear every word of this story. Because what I did next didn't just clear my name, it completely destroyed their illusion of power. Let me take you back 3 weeks before that Thanksgiving dinner exploded. That was the day they finally pushed me past my limit. It was a cold Sunday afternoon when my mother called my cell phone and ordered me to come to their house immediately. She used a panicked, breathless voice and claimed there was a life-or-death family emergency. When I stepped into their huge living room, there was no emergency, no ambulance, just a carefully orchestrated ambush. My parents were sitting on their expensive leather sofa wearing expressions of fake seriousness. Jason and Maya were lounging in velvet armchairs. Maya was meticulously polishing her brand-new quilted Chanel boy handbag with a silk cloth. She was 45 years old, African-American, worked in public relations, and never missed a chance to remind me how successful and wealthy she and Jason were. She didn't even bother to look up when I walked in. "Caroline, sit down," my father ordered. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask if I wanted a glass of water. He simply pointed at a hard wooden chair placed directly across from them, like a criminal's chair in an interrogation room. I sat down and crossed my legs. My mother immediately started crying. It was a theatrical performance I had watched hundreds of times since childhood. She dabbed a tissue against her completely dry eyes and wailed that the bank was threatening to foreclose on their house. They were carrying $400,000 in debt, and the final balloon payment was due at the end of the month. "We need you to withdraw some money from your retirement fund." "Caroline," my father said. He said it so casually, as if he were asking me to pick up a carton of milk from the grocery store. "You have plenty of savings. You don't have a husband or children to worry about. We need that $400,000 by Friday, or we're going to lose this house." I looked at all 4 of them and felt a cold knot tightening in my stomach. I had spent 30 years building my career, working 80 hours a week, saving every penny, and sacrificing my personal life to make sure I would have a safe and independent future. And now they wanted me to simply hand it all over because they had spent decades living recklessly and managing their money like fools. Jason leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Come on, Caroline," he said, using that patronizing tone he had always saved just for me. "It's the least you can do. Mom and Dad gave you everything. They paid for your braces. They gave you a roof over your head. You owe them this." Maya finally looked up from her designer bag. She smoothed down her expensive silk blouse and let out a dramatic sigh as if my presence itself exhausted her. "Exactly," she chimed in. "Family helps family, Caroline. Jason and I would be more than happy to do it, but we're putting all our liquid capital into his new tech startup. Besides, you live alone in an apartment. What do you even need that much money for? You can't take it with you when you die. You should be grateful you even have the chance to repay the people who raised you. I looked at Maya. I looked at the diamond bracelet glittering on her wrist. Then I turned and looked out the giant front window toward the driveway. Parked right behind my modest 5-year-old sedan was a brand new black Tesla Model X. It still had the dealer's temporary tag on the back. I shifted my attention back to my brother. "You're putting all your liquid capital into the business, Jason?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly even. "Is that what we're calling a $120,000 luxury electric SUV these days? An essential startup investment." Jason's face turned red with anger. "It's a legitimate business expense," he snapped, slamming his hand against the armrest. "You'd never understand how business image works, Caroline. I need to project success if I'm going to attract venture capital." Maya scoffed, rolled her eyes, and folded her arms defensively across her chest. "Don't try to deflect and attack us." She snapped, her voice dripping with arrogance. "This is about your parents losing their home. Stop being so unbelievably selfish and write the check." I stood up. The wooden chair scraped hard across the floor with a sharp screech. "I'm not selfish," I said, looking straight at my father. "I am being financially responsible, and the answer is no. I am not draining the retirement account I worked my entire life to build in order to cover a mortgage that your precious son Jason and his wife should be helping you pay." My mother's fake crying stopped instantly. Her face twisted into a mask of pure fury and cruelty. "How dare you speak to your brother and sister-in-law that way?" she hissed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Jason is building an empire. He needs money to grow his business. You just sit in some gray office staring at boring spreadsheets all day. You have more money than you know what to do with. You have to save this family." Calmly, I picked up my cardigan and draped it over my arm. "I'm not giving any of you a single cent," I said. "You have lived far beyond your means for decades, and Jason has borrowed tens of thousands of dollars from Mom and Dad without ever paying them back. I will not set myself on fire just to keep all of you warm." My father shot to his feet. He was a big, imposing man, and he used to use his size to intimidate me when I was a teenage girl. But I wasn't 15 anymore. "If you walk out that door, Carolyn," he roared, his face turning purple, "you are dead to this family, and I swear to God I'll tell everyone what you did." I paused with my hand on the brass doorknob. "What did I do?" I asked, turning my head slightly. "Exactly what did I do?" My father sneered and stepped closer. "Don't play innocent with me, you little bitch. We know all about the money Grandpa left behind. We know you stole $500,000 from his estate when you served as executor 2 years ago. We'll tell the whole family you're a filthy criminal." My blood turned to ice. My grandfather had named me sole executor of his estate because I was the only person in the family who actually knew how to read a balance sheet and manage assets. When he died, his investment accounts had already been drained. I spent months trying to figure out where that $500,000 had gone, but the paper trail had been severed completely. In the end, I had been forced to close the estate without recovering a single dollar, and now my own father was accusing me of embezzling that money. "You're out of your mind," I said, my voice dropping into a dangerous whisper. "I never touched a single penny of Grandpa's money, and you know that." "Prove it," my father spat. "Pay off our house by Friday, or we'll destroy your precious reputation. Well, tell your boss. Well, tell your corporate clients. Well, hire a lawyer and make sure you lose your license and that precious job you love so much." I looked at all 4 of them standing there together. Jason was smirking, leaning against the wall. Maya was admiring her fresh manicure, completely unbothered by the blatant blackmail happening right in front of her. My mother was glaring at me with pure hatred, and my father was waiting for me to break, to collapse, to surrender. I yanked the door open. "Go to hell," I said quietly, and walked straight out into the freezing November air. I got into my car and locked all the doors. My hands were shaking as they gripped the steering wheel. Not from fear, from rage. Before I could even put the key in the ignition, my phone buzzed inside my purse. It was a text from my Aunt Sarah. It read, "I just heard. I can't believe you stole your grandfather's life savings. You disgust me. Don't ever contact me again." Exactly 2 seconds later, another message popped up from my cousin Mark. "Pay your parents back, you greedy little thief." They had already launched the smear campaign. They must have prepared this plan weeks in advance, just waiting for the moment I refused their demand. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought I would panic cry and write them a massive check to save my career and my good name. But they had forgotten one very important detail about who I really was. I was a forensic audit director. I made my living hunting hidden money trails and exposing financial criminals. I unraveled shell companies and offshore trusts before I even finished my morning coffee. And if my family wanted to play a high-stakes financial war game, they had just challenged the final boss by accident. I shifted into reverse and backed out of the driveway, leaving their brand-new Tesla in my rearview mirror. I didn't drive home to cry into a pillow. I drove straight to my office downtown. It was Sunday night, but my executive keycard still worked. The giant glass tower was completely empty and silent. I walked into my private office, locked the door, sat at my desk, and turned on all 3 computer monitors. I logged into the firm's private investigative databases, bypassing the standard security protocols. My family wanted to talk about Grandpa's missing $500,000. Fine, I was going to find every single dollar. And when I did, I was going to burn their entire world to the ground. Before I reveal exactly what was inside that envelope, tell me in the comments below where you're watching this video from. And hit the like button and subscribe if you've ever had to stand your ground and protect yourself from the very people who were supposed to be family, but treated you like nothing more than a gold mine to exploit. My name is Caroline. I'm 55 years old. I'm a forensic audit director. But in my own family, I was never respected. To them, I was just a single woman they had every right to manipulate and drain whenever they wanted money. If you've ever been treated like a mindless ATM by the people who were supposed to love you most, simply because you chose an independent life, then you'll want to listen carefully to this story. Because what I did next shattered their illusion of power forever. Top of form. Bottom of form. Let me take you back 3 weeks before that Thanksgiving dinner ever happened. It was a cold Sunday afternoon when my mother called me, her voice full of panic, ordering me to come to their house immediately. She claimed there was a family emergency, something that threatened our very survival. But when I stepped into their massive living room, there was no emergency at all. There was only a carefully staged ambush. My parents were sitting on their leather sofa, wearing expressions of fake concern. My younger brother Jason and his wife Maya were lounging with their legs crossed in velvet armchairs. Maya was carefully polishing her expensive designer handbag with a silk cloth. She was an African-American woman who worked in public relations, and she never missed a chance to remind me just how successful and glamorous she and Jason were. She didn't even bother to look up when I walked into the room. "Sit down, Caroline," my father ordered. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask if I wanted anything to drink. He simply pointed to a stiff wooden chair placed directly across from them. I sat down, and my mother immediately began to cry. She dabbed at her completely dry eyes with a tissue and wailed that the bank was threatening to foreclose on their home. They were drowning under a $400,000 mortgage, and the final payment was due by the end of the month. "We need you to withdraw money from your retirement fund," Caroline, my father said casually, as if he were asking me to pick up a carton of milk from the store. "You have plenty of savings, and you don't have a husband or children to worry about. We need that $400,000 before Friday." I looked at all 4 of them and felt my stomach tighten into a knot. I had spent 30 years of my life working 80 hours a week to secure an independent future for myself, and now they wanted me to hand over every bit of it. Maya finally looked up from her designer bag. She smoothed out her silk blouse and let out a long, dramatic sigh. "Exactly," she chimed in with the most condescending tone. "Family is supposed to help family, Caroline. Jason and I would love to help, but we've invested all our capital into the startup, so we can't. Besides, you live all alone in a tiny apartment. You can't take your money to the grave with you. You should feel grateful that you even have the chance to repay the people who gave you life." I stared at the diamond bracelet glittering on Maya's wrist. Then I slowly turned my head and looked out through the large front window that faced the driveway. Parked arrogantly right behind my modest old sedan was a gleaming black Tesla Model X. It still had the dealership's temporary tag attached to the back. I shifted my attention back to my beloved little brother. "You're pouring all your liquid capital into the business, Jason," I asked, doing my best to keep my voice perfectly calm and free of any trace of anger. "Is that what you call a $120,000 luxury electric vehicle these days? An essential startup investment?" Jason's face flushed red with rage instantly. He slammed his hand down on the armrest of the chair. "That is a completely legitimate business expense," he snapped. "You would never understand how business image works, Caroline. I have to project success and status if I'm going to attract venture capital from serious investors." Maya let out a mocking laugh, rolled her eyes, and crossed her arms over her chest. "Don't try to deflect and attack my husband," she snapped, her voice dripping with arrogance. "This is about your parents losing their home. Stop this outrageous selfishness and sign the check like a decent daughter." I rose to my feet. The wooden chair scraped hard against the floor, letting out a sharp screech that sliced through the tense silence. "I am not selfish," I said, locking my eyes on my father's. "I'm simply being responsible with my finances and with my life. And my answer is no. I will never drain the retirement account I worked myself to the bone to build just to pay off a mortgage that your precious son Jason and his stylish wife should be helping you with." My mother's fake sobbing stopped at once, her face twisted into a mask of pure fury. "How dare you speak to your brother and sister-in-law with that disrespectful tone?" she hissed, pointing a trembling finger straight at my face. "Jason is building an empire. He needs money to grow his business and expand his connections. All you do is sit in some gray office and stare at boring spreadsheets all day. You have more money than you know what to do with, so it is your duty to save this family." I calmly picked up my coat and draped it over my arm. "I will not give any of you even a single cent," I said firmly. "You have all been living far beyond your means for decades, and Jason has borrowed tens of thousands of dollars from Mom and Dad without ever intending to pay them back. I will never set myself on fire just to keep the rest of you warm." My father shot to his feet. He was a big man, and he had used that size to intimidate me when I was younger. But I was no longer a frightened little girl. "If you dare walk out that door, Caroline," he roared, his face burning red with rage, "then you are no longer part of this family. And I swear I will tell everyone exactly what kind of disgusting thing you've done." I paused for a moment, my hand resting lightly on the brass doorknob. "What exactly have I done?" I asked calmly. "Don't play innocent," my father sneered. "We know everything about the money your grandfather left behind. We know you stole $500,000 from his estate while you were the executor of the will. Pay off this house right now, or I'll tell the entire family that you're a fraud. I'll even call your boss and make sure you lose that precious position as audit director." My blood ran cold. Not because I was afraid, but because of the sheer shamelessness of them. When my grandfather died, his investment accounts had already been mysteriously drained, and I had been forced to close the estate without finding a single real lead. And now my own father was using that very tragedy to frame me. I yanked the door open. "Do whatever you want," I said, and walked straight out into the freezing night. I climbed into my car and locked every door. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. At that exact moment, my phone buzzed inside my handbag. A message from Aunt Sarah flashed across the screen. The words hit me like a slap. "I can't believe you're the kind of disgusting person who would steal your grandfather's retirement money and now abandon your own parents. You should be ashamed of yourself." They had started their smear campaign before this meeting had even happened. They had planned the trap in advance. They believed the pressure from the entire family would make me panic, break down, and bring them the money they wanted. But they had forgotten one crucial fact. I was a financial fraud investigator, and if they wanted to play a game of tracing money with me, then they had just provoked the wrong woman. By Monday morning, right after that disastrous family meeting, my phone began vibrating nonstop. They did not waste a single second before launching their full-scale campaign to destroy my name. The first message came from Uncle Robert, the same man who had once borrowed $10,000 from my grandfather to open a hardware store gone bankrupt and never paid back a single cent. He left me a voicemail dripping with venom, calling me a disgrace to the family and demanding that I return my parents' retirement money immediately. Just a few hours later, my cousin Jessica posted a long, self-righteous rant on social media about wolves in sheep's clothing who steal inheritance money from the elderly. She even publicly tagged my mother's account in the post. The rumors spread like wildfire, and they were disturbingly specific. They claimed that I had used my role as executor of my grandfather's estate to secretly transfer exactly $500,000 from his accounts into my own personal bank account so I could live in luxury. Even the main phone line at my office started receiving calls from distant relatives I had not seen in over 20 years. My parents had turned me into a greedy, heartless monster in the eyes of the entire family. They truly believed that the crushing weight of public shame and family pressure would break me. They were convinced I would panic collapse and quietly write them a $400,000 check as ransom to silence everyone and protect my reputation. But what they did not know was this. At the exact moment those hateful messages started pouring in, I had already begun pulling apart thread by thread the fragile web of lies they had worked so hard to weave. It was Tuesday morning. I was in the middle of analyzing a network of shell bank accounts when the phone on my desk rang. It was a call from building security in the ground floor lobby. The young receptionist's voice came through panicked and confused. "Director Caroline, there's a woman and a man causing a scene in the main lobby. They say they're your family, and they're refusing to leave until you pay what they claim is a huge family debt." I calmly locked my computer screen, stepped out of my office, and headed straight for the elevator. The moment the elevator doors opened into the lobby, I heard Maya's shrill voice echoing across the entire space. She was standing with her hands on her hips, right in front of the reception desk, tapping her long, overdone acrylic nails against the marble counter. Her expensive Chanel bag still dangled from her arm like a weapon meant to display status. "Listen, little girl," Maya snapped at the receptionist in the most arrogant and ridiculous tone imaginable. "I don't care about her stupid meeting schedule. Call her right now and tell her Maya and Jason are here to collect that check. And if she doesn't come down here in 5 minutes, we'll make sure every single person in this building knows that your precious senior audit director is nothing more than a thief who stole her grandfather's retirement money." Jason stood right behind her with both hands in his pockets, looking completely smug. He had deliberately rolled up his sleeves just enough to show off his gleaming Rolex, while letting his wife do all the screaming and intimidation for him. They truly believed this cheap, noisy performance would make me panic and humiliate me in front of my company. They were convinced that to protect my professional image, I would rush downstairs, drag them into a corner, and beg them to keep quiet in exchange for a large sum of money. They were using public humiliation as a weapon of blackmail, but they had underestimated me. After decades of facing cunning financial criminals, I was no longer afraid of bullies armed with nothing but empty words. I took a slow, steady breath, straightened my blazer, and walked toward them with calm, deliberate steps. I walked toward the reception desk with the calmest composure I could summon. Maya folded her arms across her chest and lifted her chin at me. "So you finally decided to show your face," she hissed loud enough for several employees passing by to turn and stare. "We don't have all day, Caroline. Sign a $400,000 check right here, right now, and we'll promise to keep quiet about the money you stole from your grandfather. Otherwise, we'll march straight up to Human Resources and make sure this entire corporation learns what a filthy fraud you really are." I didn't blink. I didn't show a trace of fear or hesitation in the face of that cheap blackmail threat. Instead of answering, I calmly switched on my professional instincts. The eyes of a forensic auditor began scanning the two people standing in front of me. I looked down at Jason's wrist. The watch he was wearing was a solid gold Rolex Submariner. Its current market value was no less than $40,000. Then my gaze shifted to the handbag Maya was clutching against her chest like a status symbol. It was a quilted Chanel boy bag in expensive calfskin worth at least $8,000. Add that to the brand new Tesla Model X I had seen parked at my parents' house the weekend before, along with the designer silk clothes draped over both of them. They were burning through an enormous amount of cash, far beyond what an unemployed man supposedly struggling to raise startup capital should have been able to afford. Numbers never lie, and in my mind, a dark financial equation was beginning to solve itself. My grandfather's money had definitely gone somewhere, and I was starting to smell embezzlement on the very people standing there demanding money from me. "Are you deaf?" Jason growled, stepping forward. "We're talking to you. Sign the check before I make a bigger scene." That was when a deep, steady, authoritative voice came from behind me. "What exactly is going on in our lobby, Caroline?" I turned around. It was David, the senior vice president, who oversaw the corporation's entire financial fraud investigations division. He stood there staring at Jason and Maya with a cold, cutting gaze. "Is everything all right, Director of Forensic Audit?" he asked deliberately, emphasizing every word of my title so the two of them would hear it clearly. "Do you need me to call building security and have these uninvited guests removed immediately?" Maya's face changed at once. The arrogance vanished from her expression, replaced by pure confusion. Jason took a small step backward and swallowed hard. Clearly, they had always assumed I was nothing more than some invisible little office accountant typing numbers into spreadsheets all day. They had absolutely no idea how much power the woman they were trying to blackmail actually had. David gave a small nod and motioned to the two tall security guards standing near the revolving glass doors. "Please escort these two guests out of the building," David said in a tone that was perfectly polite, yet firm enough to leave no room for resistance. "They've finished their business here." Jason opened his mouth clearly about to say something in a desperate attempt to salvage what little dignity he had left. But the moment he saw the size of the security team, he clamped his lips shut and stepped back. Maya quickly lifted her designer handbag to cover half her face, trying to shield herself from the curious, judgmental stares of the office employees passing through the lobby. They rushed out of the building looking miserable and humiliated, like two thieves who had just been caught in the act. I didn't waste even a second watching them leave. I gave David a polite smile, thanked him, then turned and stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for my floor. The moment I walked into my office, I carefully locked the door and drew every blind shut. Silence settled over the room. I lowered myself into my familiar leather chair, stretched once, and turned on all three of my large computer monitors. My fingers immediately began moving across the keyboard. I pushed aside every ordinary task and logged straight into the highest-level financial intelligence database available to me. It was a server network capable of tracing money anywhere in the world, no matter how deeply it had been buried beneath layers of sophisticated shells and disguises. Encrypted security strings began racing across the dark screens. My family had chosen to use my grandfather's missing $500,000 as a weapon to blackmail me and destroy my life. "Fine," I murmured to myself in the stillness of the room. "Let's find out where Grandpa's money really went." On Wednesday morning, just as I sat down at my desk and took my first sip of coffee, my secretary walked in. She placed an envelope on my desk. It had been sent through ordinary mail, not certified delivery. The return address was printed in smeared low-quality ink bearing the name of some no-name law office tucked away in a run-down suburb. I opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Across the top in bold letters it read, "Notice before legal action." It was a letter from the attorney supposedly representing Jason and my parents. The letter threatened to sue me in state court for breach of fiduciary duty and misappropriation of assets unless I returned my grandfather's $500,000 to their account before Thanksgiving. They actually believed that a cheap piece of paper with a rubber stamp letterhead would frighten me into panicking and wiring them the money, but they had forgotten who they were threatening. I lifted the letter and actually laughed out loud in my office. From the perspective of someone who worked every day with the best corporate legal teams in the country, this letter looked like a pathetic joke. That bargain bin lawyer had not only misquoted two basic statutes on inheritance law, but also used legal terminology that was completely meaningless in context. It was not a real legal threat. It was a clumsy, amateurish extortion letter full of glaring holes and rookie mistakes. Nothing more than a cheap psychological tactic, a desperate attempt by Jason to pressure me into opening my wallet so he could keep funding the luxurious lifestyle he and his wife were addicted to. I calmly folded the letter in half and tossed it straight into the trash can beneath my desk. They wanted to play games with the law. Fine, let's see what real legal power actually looks like. I started by breaking into the National Bank's core data archive. My fingers flew across the keyboard at full speed, entering command strings that pulled up my grandfather's entire financial transaction history for the last 5 years of his life. The gray glow of the monitors flickered as thousands of dry, lifeless figures flooded the screen. But to the eyes of a forensic auditor, those numbers were not dead at all. They were a map leading straight to the scene of a financial murder. I began peeling back the layers of data, filtering out small purchases and routine medical bills so I could focus only on the large transfers. Then I traced the timeline backward to exactly 2 years before my grandfather died. They had always accused me of stealing from the estate during probate. But they had been horribly wrong. Using advanced analytical tools, I uncovered the first disgusting truth almost immediately. The $500,000 had not disappeared after my grandfather died. It had vanished on August 14th, exactly 3 months before he took his final breath. At that time, my grandfather was bedridden in the hospital, barely lucid because of the heavy pain medication in his system. So I asked myself one question. Who had executed that massive transfer? I pushed the company's AI system harder, forcing it to scan every knot in the transaction chain. The $500,000 had not been moved directly into any personal account. The thief had been clever enough to use a basic laundering technique, splitting the money into smaller amounts and routing it through 3 separate intermediary accounts at local banks in an attempt to erase the trail. But they did not understand one thing. To me, those tricks were nothing more than a child's game of hide and seek. I stayed on the money trail, stripping away every digital disguise, dragging it out of the shadows, and forcing it to reveal its final destination. Then my third monitor flashed red. Target found. The entire $500,000 had been reassembled and deposited directly into a corporate account registered under the name J.M. Consulting LLC. J.M. Jason and Maya. A cold smile spread across my lips. They had been so lazy, so arrogant, that they had used their own initials to name the shell company hiding their crime. But if I wanted to destroy them completely, I needed proof so airtight that no court could ignore it. So I accessed the original records portal and downloaded the scanned payment authorization used on August 14th of that year. I opened it on my largest screen and zoomed in on the signature in the lower right corner. Then I pulled up an old file containing my grandfather's genuine signature for comparison. Anyone with eyes could see the difference. In the final months of his life, my grandfather's real signature was always shaky, broken, and weak because of his illness. But the signature on that $500,000 transfer was smooth, deliberate, and carefully sculpted. It was a blatant, clumsy forgery. They had not just stolen money. Jason and Maya had committed bank fraud, document forgery, and financial exploitation of an elderly man. I downloaded the entire evidence file and saved it to a high-security encrypted drive. I also sent a duplicate copy directly to the company's secure server so no one could ever destroy it. They had dug their own grave, and then like fools they had handed me the shovel. What I felt in that moment was not just the satisfaction of a woman clearing her name. It was the thrill of a predator finally tightening its grip around the prey's throat. The sentence for crimes like these was federal prison, and it had taken me less than 30 minutes to solve the case. But the ammunition I had gathered in that half hour was enough to wipe their entire world off the map forever. I clicked into the bank's core archive and pulled up my grandfather's full transaction history for the last 6 months of his life. Numbers began streaming down the screen. They had always claimed that I stole the money during probate after he died. But the moment I applied my forensic filters, the first disgusting truth came into focus. That $500,000 did not disappear after my grandfather passed away. It vanished on August 14th, exactly 3 months before he took his final breath. At that point in August, my grandfather was bedridden in intensive care and heavily sedated by powerful pain medication. There was no possible way he could have personally authorized a transfer of that size. I immediately instructed the system to map every transaction node and show me where the money had actually gone. The thief had tried to be clever by using a laughably amateur laundering tactic. They split the $500,000 into 3 separate transfers and pushed them through local bank accounts to blur the trail. But to a director of forensic audit, that kind of trick was nothing more than a child's game of hide and seek. I reassembled the money flow with ease, peeled back each layer of cover, and forced the trail to reveal its final destination. Then a red alert flashed across my monitor. The entire amount had been funneled directly into a business account registered to an LLC called JM Consulting. JM Consulting. The registered principals were none other than Jason and Maya. They had been so lazy and so arrogant that they had actually used their own initials to name the ridiculous shell company hiding their crime. To secure proof that no one could ever dispute, I accessed the original records portal and downloaded the scanned copy of the cashier's authorization used that day. I zoomed in on the signature at the bottom. My grandfather's real signature in the last months of his life had been shaky, broken, and fragile, destroyed by illness. But the ink on this transfer document was smooth, deliberate, and carefully shaped. It was a blatant forgery. My precious little brother and his wife had not merely stolen money. They had committed bank fraud, document forgery, and elder financial exploitation against a dying man lying helpless in a hospital bed. Their little blackmail game had just officially become a criminal case. But Jason's greed did not stop at my grandfather's $500,000. My professional instincts pushed me to dig even deeper. I shifted my investigation toward my parents' own asset records. It took only 15 more minutes inside the state property database for me to uncover a truth even crueler than the first. The house my parents were living in, the very home they were so proud to show off, no longer truly belonged to them. 6 months earlier, Jason had tricked them into signing a reverse mortgage agreement, draining the equity from the house to fund the lavish lifestyle he and Maya were addicted to. And because he had stopped making the interest payments for months, the bank had already begun foreclosure proceedings. The house was scheduled to be quietly auctioned off as early as tomorrow. My parents had no idea that their precious son had stripped away the very roof over their heads. They wanted to use the law to intimidate me. A slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across my lips. The greatest opportunity of my life had just arrived. I reached for my phone and dialed my personal financial attorney. It was time for me to go shopping. The next morning, my phone lit up with my mother's name, Diane. I let it ring 3 times before I slowly answered. The second the call connected, I was hit with dramatic, trembling sobs from the other end. My mother did not even bother to say hello. She went straight into the victim performance she had perfected over decades. "Caroline, you're killing me," she cried, her voice shaking with theatrical anguish. "Do you have any idea your father was up all night clutching his chest because of heart pains? The bank sent another notice. We're about to be thrown out into the street like beggars, and it's all because of your cold-blooded selfishness." Without saying a word, I quietly pressed the call record button on my secondary screen and listened. My silence only encouraged her to perform harder. "I carried you for 9 months. I sacrificed everything to raise you," she wailed. "I never asked you for anything except a little gratitude. You have hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting untouched in your bank account, while your own parents are about to end up sleeping on the sidewalk." Jason and Maya have been crying their eyes out over us. They said they cannot believe their own sister could be cruel enough to let this family die over a little bit of money. "You need to wire the money to Jason's lawyer today, Caroline. If you don't, I swear I will die because of you." She kept hammering at me with the heaviest guilt she could find, trying to drag shame and panic out of me. Any ordinary daughter might have broken down, apologized, and given in. But what she didn't know was that I was sitting right in front of a computer screen displaying ironclad proof that her precious golden son was the one who had stolen that house from them in the first place. Instead of answering her tear-soaked accusations, I simply hung up. I didn't block any of their numbers. I wanted the line to stay open so I could monitor exactly how far their delusions were spiraling. For the next 4 days, I adopted a strategy of absolute silence. I didn't respond to a single text. I didn't answer a single call from my parents or from my brother and his wife. For people who are used to controlling others through emotional manipulation and loud confrontations, silence is the one thing that unsettles them the most. So they did what people like them always do. They began inventing a fantasy that made them feel powerful. They interpreted my silence as terror. They convinced themselves I was panicking, falling apart, and running from bank to bank trying to break open my retirement fund to scrape together the $400,000. By the 3rd day, Jason started sending smug, patronizing texts. He wrote, I know you'll make the right decision for the family. Just make sure the money hits the lawyer's account before Friday afternoon." Maya was even more shameless. She posted a photo on social media of the two of them having dinner at one of the city's most expensive steakhouses with a caption celebrating their upcoming financial victory. They were publicly celebrating the money they were certain they were about to squeeze out of me. My father also sent a short email ordering me to appear at Thanksgiving dinner on Thursday hand over the check in front of the entire family and publicly apologize. They had prepared the perfect stage to humiliate me in front of 30 relatives and force me into total submission. They were intoxicated by their own illusion of power. But what they didn't know was this. During those days of silence, I was not crying. I was not calling the bank. I was not trying to pull money out of my retirement account. My silence was not the surrender of a cornered woman. It was the deadly silence of a hunter, patiently watching the prey walk step by step into a steel trap that had already been set. I sat in my office, sipping black coffee, calmly preparing the legal documents that would bring their entire kingdom of lies crashing down forever. On Wednesday morning, exactly one day before Thanksgiving dinner, I walked into Marcus's office. He was my personal asset attorney, a sharp and highly feared figure in Chicago's financial law circles. I sat down in the leather chair across from his desk and slid a thin case file onto the glass surface. "Marcus," I said, my tone cold and precise. "The bank is foreclosing on my parents' house at 10 o'clock this morning. They defaulted on a reverse mortgage my brother tricked them into signing. I want you to represent me and buy that house outright at the auction." Marcus opened the file, scanned the statements, and looked up at me with a calm, professional expression. "A full cash acquisition?" he asked. "Yes," I said with a nod. "A 100% cash offer. No credit approval, no mortgage process, no delays. The bank wants to unload this bad debt as fast as possible, and they will not turn down an immediate cash deal that can close on the spot. But I have one condition. I do not want my real name appearing on any public record at this stage. I want you to establish an anonymous LLC immediately and use that legal entity to hold title." Marcus smiled the smile of a man who knew exactly how power worked. "An anonymous LLC will guarantee complete privacy," he said. "Your family and that ridiculous lawyer of theirs will have no idea who the new owner is until you decide to reveal it yourself." He immediately picked up his desk phone and began making a rapid series of urgent calls to his network of court and banking contacts. Within 2 hours, a complex legal process had been completed at breathtaking speed. I pulled out my phone and wired exactly $450,000 from my personal investment account into the law firm's escrow account. It was an enormous amount of money, but for a senior audit executive who had worked relentlessly for 3 decades, it was only a fraction of what my investments had earned. At exactly noon, Marcus stepped back into the room and placed a fresh stack of legal documents in front of me, the ink still smelling new. "This is the signed and sealed purchase agreement approved by the bank," he said. "From this moment on, your LLC officially owns all rights and title to that property. The house is now legally yours. The only remaining step is for the state recording office to issue the updated deed under your entity's name." I reached out and touched the papers. A deep sense of real power surged through me. At that exact moment, my parents were probably busy inside that house roasting turkey and preparing the dining room for a Thanksgiving dinner designed to blackmail me. They were intoxicated by the illusion of control. They had no idea that the roof over their heads, the wooden floor beneath their feet, no longer belonged to them. They had officially become unlawful occupants in my house. I thanked Marcus, gathered every legal document into my leather handbag, and rose to my feet. The sharpest legal weapons were now fully prepared. The ultimate move was finally in my hands. And now it was time for me to go home and attend the most expensive Thanksgiving dinner of their lives. At 3 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, just a few hours before Thanksgiving dinner, my apartment doorbell rang. A courier stood outside, holding a sealed confidential envelope stamped with Marcus's law firm seal. I signed for it, closed the door, and carried the envelope to my dining table. My hand was perfectly steady as I broke the seal. Inside was the official property deed embossed with the state's gold seal. The owner's name was not my parents'. It was not the bank's either. It clearly listed the anonymous legal entity I had just created. I slowly ran my fingers across the textured paper over every bold printed word. What I felt in that moment was more than victory. It was absolute control. Every threat, every manipulation, every fake tear they had thrown at me was now nothing more than a worthless comedy. They were preparing a grand dinner to humiliate me, to force me to hand over my retirement money inside the very house they still believed was theirs. But in truth, they were nothing more than uninvited occupants standing on my hardwood floors and breathing the air inside my property. I stepped into my dressing room to get ready. I did not choose a glamorous gown or expensive jewelry to show off the way Maya always did. Real wealth and real power never need to scream for attention. I chose a pair of carefully tailored high-waisted trousers and a dark blue silk blouse, simple, sharp, and cold like a suit of armor. I brushed my hair, neatly applied a touch of deep lipstick, and looked straight at my reflection in the large mirror. The woman staring back at me was no longer a pitiful daughter being exploited by her family. She was a woman who held the power of life and death over everything they thought they controlled. I picked up the brown envelope, filled with legal documents, slipped it into the bottom of my leather handbag, grabbed a tray of baked goods, and walked out the door with my head held high. It was time to go to dinner, top of form. Bottom of form. I pulled into the familiar driveway at 6 o'clock that evening. The sky was already dark, and the bitter Thanksgiving air hit my face the moment I stepped out of the car. In my hands was a still warm pecan pie. The second I pushed open the front door and walked inside, the noise of 30 relatives laughing and chatting died instantly. It was like someone had yanked the plug out of a radio. 30 pairs of eyes turned toward me at once. The hostility in that room was so thick you could almost touch it. They looked at me with absolute disgust, the way people look at some filthy sinner daring to step into sacred ground. My parents had clearly spent the last several days poisoning the entire family with lies. They had filled their heads with a story in which I was the cold-blooded daughter who stole Grandpa's inheritance and was now willing to throw her own parents into the street without a shred of mercy. I smiled and gave a polite nod to a few of my older aunts and uncles. Not one of them nodded back. A few even turned their faces away in open contempt. But instead of feeling ashamed or intimidated the way they expected me to, I felt perfectly calm. I carried the pie through the oversized living room at an unhurried pace. While they were busy judging my character, I was busy assessing the condition of my property. My eyes moved to a section of wall near the dining room corner, and I noticed the beige paint had already started yellowing and peeling. Quietly, I made a note to have that outdated wallpaper stripped off and the entire first floor repainted in an elegant soft gray the moment I threw these toxic people out. The oak flooring beneath my feet creaked lightly as I crossed the room. That would need sanding and a fresh coat of finish, too. My parents had always bragged about class and status, but in reality, they had neglected this house for years while pouring money into luxury items to feed their vanity. I walked straight into the kitchen, set the pie down on the marble counter, and took a slow, deep breath. They thought I had entered the lion's den to cry beg and hand over a ransom payment. What they didn't know was that I was simply inspecting the condition of the asset I now legally owned. I slowly stepped out of the kitchen and into the main living room where most of the family had gathered. Right in the center of the room, Maya had made herself the star of the evening. She was wearing an expensive emerald green silk dress that clung perfectly to her body, paired with a set of original designer heels. Around her neck shimmered a diamond necklace, and she kept touching it every few seconds while she talked, making sure everyone noticed. Her sharp, piercing voice carried across the room, drowning out nearly every other conversation. Jason is about to close a multi-million-dollar investment deal for his tech startup, Maya bragged to a cluster of aunts and uncles gathered around her. And next month, we've already paid in full for a 10-day getaway to the Maldives to celebrate. You know, when you work in public relations and move in elite circles, image is everything. That's why we had to upgrade to a brand new Tesla. It's not just a car, it's a statement of social status. The relatives nodded in admiration, tossing out fake little gasps of approval. Uncle Robert slapped Jason on the shoulder and called him the shining pride of the family. Jason puffed out his chest, pretending to be humble, but his eyes were full of arrogance. Not a single one of the 30 people standing in that room realized that all of that flashy wealth was nothing but a hollow costume built on stolen money, forged signatures, and urgent foreclosure notices from the bank. I leaned against the marble kitchen island with a glass of red wine in my hand. I didn't interrupt. I didn't expose their ridiculous lies. I simply stood there in icy calm, silently watching the pathetic little performance unfold in front of me. Maya's arrogance at that moment was like a balloon blown far beyond its limit, waiting for the smallest pin to burst it. She kept glancing at me with a look full of challenge and triumph. She even raised her voice on purpose, emphasizing every detail of her success so I would hear it clearly. She wanted me to feel small. She wanted me to feel jealous and humiliated for being a 55-year-old single woman with a boring audit job and no designer labels to show off. But she didn't understand one basic law of power. People who truly hold power never need to shout to prove their worth to anyone. Inside my mind, the real numbers were running with perfect clarity. Her overdue credit card balances, Jason's defaulted mortgage debt, the foreclosure order, and the property transfer documents resting quietly inside my leather handbag on the sofa already in my possession. I took a sip of wine and let the slight bitterness slide down my throat. Enjoy your fake spotlight while you still can, Maya, I thought. Breathe in this house as deeply as you want, because this will be the last luxurious party where you ever get to play the role of a successful woman before I pull the velvet curtain down on your entire illusion. I remained leaning against the marble kitchen island, sipping my wine one slow mouthful at a time, that faint smile still resting on my lips. The space around me had turned into a toll booth for hatred. Relatives kept drifting past me to refill their plates and glasses, and not one of them missed the chance to throw out the cruelest jab they could manage. Aunt Martha was the first to strike. She swept by, flicked back her carefully curled hair, and shot me a look of pure disgust. "I cannot believe you had the nerve to show your face here today, Caroline," she hissed through clenched teeth. "Stealing your own grandfather's retirement money and now heartlessly throwing your own parents into the street. You are the greatest disgrace this family has ever produced. No wonder you are still alone at your age. No man could ever tolerate a venomous snake like you." I didn't bother responding. I simply lifted my wine glass slightly like a silent toast laced with mockery. Barely 5 minutes later, my overweight cousin Greg shoved his way over. He deliberately slammed his shoulder into mine as he reached for a cube of cheese from the tray. "Careful there, thief!" he growled in a threatening tone. "You may be some big-shot audit director, but you'll never be able to audit that rotten conscience of yours. Uncle Richard and Aunt Diane worked their whole lives to raise you and give you an education, and this is how you repay them. By pulling some filthy stunt to extort money from them. You should be ashamed to swallow a single bite of food in this house." Other whispers kept sliding into my ears from every direction. Ungrateful daughter, filthy fraud, cold-hearted monster. One after another they reached for the ugliest words they could find, trying to crush my dignity in front of everyone in that room. They thought those sharpened little verbal knives would pierce the armor I had built around myself. They were hoping I would break down in tears, run to the bathroom in humiliation, or collapse at my parents' feet, begging for forgiveness. But what they didn't understand was that every insult they threw at me was only making the punishment I was about to deliver more perfect. They were standing there loudly condemning me on hardwood floors that legally belonged to me. They were passionately defending the very swindlers who had stolen this house without the faintest idea of the rotten truth underneath it all. I finished my glass of wine, kept my back straight, and waited patiently for judgment to begin. At exactly 7 o'clock, my mother emerged from the kitchen and loudly announced that Thanksgiving dinner was ready. All 30 relatives began moving toward the long oak dining table, draped in a spotless white silk tablecloth. They scrambled for the best seats around Jason and Maya as if they were gathering around royalty. As for me, the only chair left was placed all the way at the far end of the table near the door, like a deliberate act of exile. I calmly pulled out the chair and sat down, smoothed the crease of my tailored trousers, and kept my back perfectly straight, full of quiet pride. The moment everyone had taken their seats and the steaming dishes began passing from hand to hand, my father slowly rose from the head of the table. He picked up his silver fork and tapped it lightly 3 times against the side of his crystal wineglass. The sharp, ringing sound sliced through every whisper and conversation. The entire room fell into a deadly silence. 30 faces turned toward him at once, then just as quickly shifted their cold, hostile stares toward me. My father cleared his throat, folded his hands together, and looked at me with the eyes of a ruthless judge preparing to deliver a sentence. The family trial against me had officially begun. Family. My father began his speech with that single word, stressing it hard. Thanksgiving is supposed to be a sacred moment when we gather together and give thanks for what we have. But this year, Diane and I are bleeding inside. He slowly swept his gaze around the dining room, putting on the performance of a man drowning in pain and betrayal. Every aunt, uncle, and cousin sat there in silence, nodding along with sympathy. As a father, there is no agony greater than being forced to admit that the very child you brought into this world has become a traitor. We spent our entire lives sacrificing for Caroline. We worked ourselves to the bone day and night going without, so she would always have a roof over her head, warm clothes on her back, and the finest education money could buy. We gave her everything a child could ever dream of. And how did she repay that sacrifice? He paused, blinking, as if trying to squeeze out a tear, then turned his furious eyes toward the chair where I sat. She turned her back on the very people who gave her life. She flatly refused to help her own parents while we stood on the edge of ruin, about to lose this house. But even that cold-hearted cruelty is not the worst of her crimes. My father slammed his large hand down on the wooden table, making several crystal glasses rattle violently. Tonight, in front of this entire family, I am forced to expose a disgusting truth we have gritted our teeth and kept hidden for 2 years. Caroline is not just an ungrateful daughter. She is a filthy thief. A wave of shocked, outraged murmurs broke out from the far end of the table. My mother lifted her lace-trimmed handkerchief to cover half her face, acting out the next part of her sobbing performance beside him. My father took a deep breath and raised his voice even higher, drowning out the noise. When my father passed away, Caroline manipulated her way into becoming the sole executor of his estate. We trusted her blindly and handed over total control of the family assets. And she abused that position. Using all her clever accounting tricks, she stole the entire $500,000 from the estate of a dying old man. She secretly siphoned every last cent of that sacred retirement money into her own hidden accounts so she could live a selfish, comfortable life. And while she was doing that, she left her own parents to struggle under crushing debt that she helped create. Then he pointed a trembling finger straight at my face, his eyes bloodshot with hatred. You sit there acting like some respectable senior audit director, but in reality you are nothing more than a rotten parasite. You stole from the dead Caroline. You used that filthy money to build your career and your freedom. And now that your parents need that very same money to save their home, you slam the door in our faces. You are the greatest disgrace this family has ever known. Tonight, I officially cast you out of this family until you get down on your knees, beg for forgiveness, and repay every last cent you stole. The moment my father finished speaking, Jason slowly rose from his chair. He lowered his head, shook it gently, and let out a long, heavy sigh. It was a flawless performance, the picture of a younger brother supposedly heartbroken by his own sister's betrayal. He ran a hand back through his hair and blinked several times as if he were fighting back tears. Everyone here knows I did everything I could to protect her. Jason began, his voice trembling with practiced emotion. I called Caroline dozens of times. I even went to her workplace and begged her to reconsider. I told her we were family and that every mistake could still be forgiven if she would just return the money she stole from Grandpa and save our parents' home. But she coldly pushed me away. She even had security throw Maya and me out of her office building in the most humiliating way possible. Soft gasps of sympathy rippled around the dining room. A few of my aunts pulled tissues from their sleeves and dabbed at their eyes. Maya reached for Jason's hand and clasped it tightly, playing the part of the loyal, supportive wife, comforting a deeply wounded man. Jason looked up at me with an expression full of sorrow. "Caroline," he said, his voice dropping into a tone of weary resignation, "I never wanted it to come to this. I've always respected you. I've always been proud to tell my friends that my sister was such a successful audit director, but I can't just stand by while you trample all over Mom and Dad's sacrifices. I can't let them end up sleeping on the street because of your greed. They're exhausted, and as the only son in this family, it's my duty to stand up and protect them." I sat there with my arms folded silently, watching every fake gesture. He was performing so well, I almost wanted to applaud. He had wrapped himself in the cloak of a moral savior, hiding the filthy truth that he was the one who had tricked our parents into mortgaging their home and burned through their money on luxury cars and extravagant vacations. He was weaponizing fake tears to turn 30 relatives into an angry jury ready to condemn me. I had hoped this could be handled quietly within the family. Jason continued slipping a hand into the pocket of his suit jacket. But Caroline has become completely heartless. She left me no choice except to take the harshest legal steps available. I'm sorry to everyone for ruining this sacred Thanksgiving dinner, but she gave me no other option. Right after that tear-soaked speech, Jason's entire demeanor changed. He no longer looked like a wounded, long-suffering younger brother. He slipped a hand into the pocket of his expensive tailored suit jacket and pulled out a legal document folded neatly into thirds. Without saying another word, he strode down the length of the table toward where I was sitting and slammed the paper down right beside my dinner plate. The crack of it against the oak table echoed through the room. "This is an official court summons from the state." Jason barked, his voice now stripped of all fake emotion and replaced with something cold and vicious. "You refused every attempt this family made to settle this peacefully, so now we do this through the law. This document demands that you return the full $400,000 along with additional damages for the emotional suffering you caused our parents. You have exactly 48 hours. If that money is not sitting in our attorney's account by noon next Monday, you will be standing in court. You will lose your audit license, you will lose your reputation, and you will go to prison for stealing from the elderly." Maya rose from her chair as well, folding her arms across her chest with a smug little smile curling across her face. "You should just write the check, Caroline," she called down the table. "Don't fool yourself into thinking your little office job can protect you against the legal team Jason and I hired. Just return the money to your parents and disappear from our lives for good. Don't make this any more humiliating than it already is." I glanced around the room. A few relatives had already pulled out their phones and were secretly recording. They wanted to capture the exact moment the arrogant audit director broke down, cried, and begged for mercy. They were waiting to see my hand shake as I picked up that pathetic summons. They thought that ridiculous piece of paper was a death sentence. They had no idea it was simply an invitation for me to finally open the brown envelope resting quietly inside my handbag. The dining room instantly exploded into a marketplace of hatred. All 30 relatives joined in echoing Jason's verdict. Heartless. Trash. Ungrateful. They hurled the ugliest words they could find at me as if I were some piece of filth that needed to be erased from their world. I could see at least 5 cell phones raised high from the other side of the table. Their cameras were pointed straight at my face. Flashes burst in sharp, blinding pulses. They were recording everything ready to post it online the moment I broke. They wanted the world to witness the downfall of the arrogant audit director. My father stood there with his arms folded, looking at me with absolute triumph. My mother kept up her sniffling little performance beside him. Jason and Maya wore smug smiles, waiting for the exact second I finally surrendered. The tension in the room was so thick it was hard to breathe. 30 people were holding their breath, waiting for tears to spill down my face, waiting for me to pick up that summons with trembling hands, waiting for me to fall to my knees and beg for mercy. They were waiting for tears. They were waiting for me to completely fall apart. All 30 people in that room held their breath and stared at me like vultures circling a corpse ready to tear it apart. Jason wore a smug, victorious grin, while my mother kept her handkerchief pressed against half her face to finish the performance of a grieving victim. Several relatives already had their phones recording, eager to capture the most humiliating moment in the life of a female audit director. But they were about to be deeply disappointed. I looked down at the cheap court summons resting beside my dish of cranberry sauce. I did not cry. I did not tremble. I did not gasp in shock. Instead, I slowly lifted my wine glass, took one final sip to wet my throat, and set it gently back on the table. Then a faint, icy smile began to form on my lips. I reached into my leather handbag and pulled out a glasses case. Very calmly, I opened it, removed my reading glasses, and placed them on my face. Every movement I made was slow, precise, and utterly controlled. There was not the slightest trace of panic, and the atmosphere in the dining room began to shift. The triumph on Jason's face faltered ever so slightly when he noticed my strange calm. Still without saying a word, I reached deep into the bottom of my handbag and pulled out a large brown envelope, thick and heavy with documents. I lifted it just high enough for all 30 people in the room to see it clearly. Then I slammed it down onto the oak table. The crack it made was sharp and thunderous, completely drowning out the pathetic little sound his court summons had made moments earlier. I stared at the pathetic scrap of paper Jason had just slammed onto the table. Then I lifted my eyes and looked straight into the face he was trying so hard to make look intimidating. A cold, faint smile slowly spread across my lips. "Do you really think a worthless piece of paper printed by some anonymous little law office in the suburbs can scare me, Jason?" I said slowly. My voice was not loud, but the authority and stillness in every word were enough to silence every whisper and insult in the dining room instantly. "Do you even know what I do for a living? I am not some insignificant little office accountant punching numbers into dull spreadsheets the way you and this family have always chosen to imagine. I am a director of forensic audit." I paused on purpose and let that title hang in the air of the room. All 30 people who had been holding up their phones to record suddenly froze. Even the flashes seemed to stop. The hostility that had filled the room only seconds earlier was replaced by total confusion. Jason frowned, and for the first time real uncertainty cracked across his face. He clearly had no idea what forensic audit actually meant, but the sheer force of my composure made him feel that something enormous and dangerous was about to crash down on him. "Let me explain it clearly for you." I continued, my voice even and sharp as a blade. "My job is to trace dirty money. I investigate sophisticated financial fraud schemes worth tens of millions of dollars. I expose shell companies laundering operations and people who forge documents to steal assets. I work directly with federal investigators and some of the most powerful corporate legal teams in the country to send financial criminals to federal prison. And you, Jason, actually thought you could wave around some cheap, incompetent lawyer who can't even cite the most basic inheritance laws correctly, and use that to threaten a forensic audit specialist. You are trying to outsmart a master craftsman with a plastic toy." Jason's face changed instantly. That ridiculous arrogance, that smug satisfaction he had been wearing moments ago, vanished without a trace. The color drained from his skin, turning it paper white. His eyes widened in fear, and the hand he had braced against the oak table began to tremble uncontrollably. Maya, sitting right beside him, stared open-mouthed, unable to say a single word. My parents, seated at the head of the table, had gone completely rigid. At last, all of them were beginning to understand one horrifying truth. They had not cornered some weak little lamb. They had provoked a real monster in the world of finance. And now that monster was about to devour their entire lives, using the very laws they had tried to weaponize against me. The dining room was so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. I slowly opened the thick brown envelope and pulled out a stack of high-security bank statements. I did not just hand them to Jason. I tossed them across the long oak table. The heavy papers slid across the polished wood, scattering slightly, and stopping right in front of his plate. I looked at my father, and then at the 30 relatives who were still holding their phones. "You all want to know where the $500,000 went?" I said, my voice steady and echoing in the silent room. "You all accused me of stealing the inheritance after grandfather passed away. But numbers tell a very different story. And unlike greedy people, numbers never lie." I pointed at the top document. "That is a certified bank record. It shows that exactly 3 months before grandfather took his last breath, while he was lying in the intensive care unit completely heavily medicated and slipping in and out of a coma, a single wire transfer of $500,000 was executed. The money did not just vanish. It was routed through 3 different local banks to hide its trail before landing safely in a corporate account. I took a slow step forward, looking directly into Jason's pale and sweating face. The account belongs to a limited liability company called J.M. Consulting. J and M, Jason and Maya. You two were so incredibly arrogant and lazy that you used your own initials to name your little money laundering shell company. Maya gasped loudly, her hand flying to her chest. The relatives started muttering, looking deeply confused and shocked. I did not give them a single second to recover. I pulled out the next sheet of paper and read the highlighted transactions aloud. Let us look at the recent business expenses of JM Consulting. I continued, my tone dripping with pure ice. $80,000 wired to a Tesla dealership for a brand new Model X. $15,000 paid to a luxury travel agency for a 10-day resort package in the Maldives. $8,000 spent at a Chanel boutique downtown. I paused and looked right at the quilted leather bag sitting on the chair next to Maya. That is a very nice bag, Maya. It is a terrible shame you bought it with the money meant for a dying old man's medical care. Jason slammed his hands on the table, trying to stand up. That is a complete lie, he shouted, his voice cracking with sheer panic. Grandfather gave us that money as a gift to start our business. He signed the check himself because he believed in me. I smiled because I was waiting for him to say exactly that. I reached into the envelope one last time and pulled out a glossy photograph. It was a high-resolution magnification of the signature on the authorization check, placed right next to a verified sample of grandfather's real handwriting. I slid it down the center of the table so everyone could see it clearly. Grandfather had a severe illness in his final months, I said coldly. His real signature was weak and shaky, but the signature on that $500,000 check is smooth, firm, and perfectly crafted. I had it analyzed by an independent forensic handwriting expert. The official forensic report is attached right there. It confirms a 100% certainty of forgery. You did not just take the money, Jason. You forged a dying man's signature, committed federal wire fraud, and engaged in severe elder financial abuse. That is not a family dispute. That is a felony carrying a minimum of 10 years in federal prison. The dining room instantly exploded into absolute chaos. Maya dropped her crystal wine glass onto the hardwood floor, and it shattered into dozens of sharp pieces. Her face turned completely pale as she frantically looked around the room and began to stammer uncontrollably. She muttered that she knew nothing about any forged signatures and claimed she only spent the money Jason gave her. Jason aggressively pushed his chair back and slammed both of his fists onto the table. His neck veins bulged as he desperately tried to shout over the loud whispers of the 30 relatives. He loudly declared that the documents were fake and accused me of fabricating the bank statements to frame him. He pointed his trembling finger at me and called me a jealous liar. My father, Richard, quickly stood up from the head of the table to protect his precious golden boy. He waved his hands frantically in the air, demanding everyone to calm down. He nervously insisted that there must be a massive misunderstanding and that Jason would never do such a terrible thing to his own grandfather. My mother, Diane, began to sob loudly, clutching her chest and begging me to stop destroying our family. The chaotic noise in the dining room continued to echo as my parents desperately tried to defend their precious son. My father was loudly demanding that everyone ignore my fabricated documents. My mother was sobbing uncontrollably and begging me to just pay the $400,000 to save their beloved home from the bank. I stood there perfectly still and watched them perform their pathetic play for a few more seconds. Then I raised my hand and slapped the solid wood table just once. The sharp sound cut through their hysterical shouting like a blade. The room fell into absolute silence once again. I looked directly into my father and let out a soft and chilling laugh. "You are demanding that I empty my retirement accounts to save your house," I said slowly and clearly. My mother nodded eagerly, wiping away her fake tears, hoping I was finally giving up. I tilted my head and stared at them with complete pity. I watched the sheer ignorance mask their faces. They truly believed they held all the power in this room. "What house are you talking about?" I asked, my voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. My father blinked in confusion. He puffed out his chest and pointed angrily at the floorboards beneath our feet. "This house," he shouted back. "The house you grew up in. The house the bank is threatening to take away because of your incredible selfishness." I shook my head slowly. "You still do not understand, do you?" I replied, stepping away from the table. "You are standing here staging a massive public trial, trying to publicly humiliate me into paying a ransom for a property you think you own. But you are fighting for a ghost." I reached into my leather bag for the final time. The ultimate truth was about to crush their entire world. I pulled a thick stack of formal legal notices from the very bottom of my leather bag and dropped them right next to the forged check on the dining table. The heavy thud made my father flinch. I looked at him and my mother with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. "You have spent the last hour demanding that I pay off a debt to save this house," I said calmly. "But you do not even know what debt you are talking about. You thought you were just behind on a few standard mortgage payments. You thought Jason was just having a temporary cash flow problem with his tech startup. You believed his lies because you always chose to believe his lies." I slid the first document across the polished oak wood toward my father. "Read it," I instructed him coldly. "That is a formal notice of default from the National Bank. 6 months ago, your precious son convinced you to sign a massive stack of complex financial papers. He probably told you it was a routine refinancing process or a simple guarantor form for his new business venture. But you did not read the fine print. You blindly trusted the golden boy of this family. What you actually signed was a highly aggressive home equity line of credit and a reverse mortgage agreement. He completely drained every single dollar of value out of this property. He extracted your entire life savings from the equity of this house to fund his lavish lifestyle. He took the cash to buy his luxury electric cars, his vacations, and his wife designer clothes, while leaving you with a massive balloon payment that you could never possibly afford." My father stared at the legal document with wide eyes. His hands began to shake violently as he read the bold letters printed at the top of the page. My mother stopped her fake sobbing and leaned over his shoulder, her face turning the color of wet ash. "And it gets much worse," I continued, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the dining room. "Jason took all that cash, and then he completely stopped making the monthly interest payments. He ignored the final warnings. He ignored the penalty fees. He intercepted the Daily Mail and hid the warning letters from the bank so you would not find out the truth. And because of his deliberate negligence, the bank officially initiated foreclosure proceedings exactly 90 days ago. They legally seized the property. This house went into permanent default and was listed for a private bank auction." I pointed directly at Jason, who was now sinking lower into his expensive dining chair. He looked like a cornered rat, sweating profusely and completely unable to make eye contact with his parents. "He knew the bank was going to physically kick you out onto the street by the end of this week," I said. "That is exactly why he orchestrated this entire pathetic Thanksgiving dinner. That is why he hired a fake lawyer to send me a garbage extortion letter. He was desperately trying to squeeze $400,000 out of my retirement fund at the very last second to cover his tracks and save himself from a massive fraud investigation. He never cared about saving your home. He only cared about saving his own skin from federal prison." My father slowly looked up from the bank foreclosure notice and turned his head toward Jason. The anger and arrogance that had consumed his face just a few minutes ago were completely destroyed. He opened his mouth to scream, but absolutely no sound came out. The psychological shock was so profound that it paralyzed his vocal cords. My mother collapsed back into her chair, clutching her chest for real this time, her eyes wide with sheer terror. The 30 relatives around the room stood completely frozen in horror as they watched the perfect illusion of this wealthy family shatter into a million irreparable pieces. They finally realized that the real monster was not the daughter sitting at the end of the table, but the golden boy cowering right next to them. The room was still completely paralyzed from the shocking revelation. I reached into my leather bag one last time to deliver the final strike. The last piece of paper was not a bank statement or a foreclosure notice from the lender. It was a thick, high-quality legal document with a heavy golden state seal securely embossed at the top right corner. I held it up high in the air so the bright light from the dining room chandelier caught the shining golden emblem. "This is a certified property deed," I said slowly, letting the heavy words sink deep into their panicked minds. "When the National Bank officially foreclosed on this property, they put it up for a private cash auction early this morning. They desperately wanted to recover the massive stolen funds as quickly as possible. So I made a quick phone call to my private wealth management lawyer downtown. I instructed him to immediately establish an anonymous limited liability company under my direct control. And then I transferred $450,000 in pure liquid cash directly from my personal investment portfolio to purchase this exact property outright. I paid off the massive fraudulent debt that your precious Jason created. The bank accepted my cash offer immediately and handed over the full legal rights to my legal team. I looked down at my father, who was now shaking uncontrollably, and my mother, who was staring at me with complete and utter horror. "You truly thought you could use this holiday dinner to force me to pay a ransom for a house you no longer owned. You actually thought you were the powerful masters of this domain. But you are currently standing on my hardwood floors. You are eating dinner in my dining room. You are sitting comfortably on my chairs. The anonymous corporate entity listed on this state-certified deed belongs entirely and exclusively to me. This means that I am now the sole legal owner of this entire estate. Every single brick, every piece of furniture, and the very roof over your heads right now legally belongs to me." I slowly lowered the deed and placed it perfectly in the center of the table, right next to the forged bank check. The absolute power shifted permanently in that exact second. "You wanted to play a ruthless game of financial blackmail," I said coldly to the completely silent room. "Well, you played the game, and you lost everything." Another crystal glass slipped from the edge of the long table and shattered against the floorboards. The loud crash broke the dead silence, but no one dared to move. My father, Richard, suddenly grabbed the left side of his chest and slumped heavily against the back of his chair. His face turned completely pale as he gasped for air, staring blankly at the certified property deed in front of him. The arrogant man who had just threatened to disown me was now crumbling under the weight of his own foolishness. Maya was shaking uncontrollably. She frantically grabbed her expensive smartphone with trembling fingers and tried to dial her fake lawyer. Her perfectly manicured hands slipped on the screen as she whispered in absolute panic, but the call went straight to a disconnected voicemail. She dropped the phone onto her lap and began to weep silently, her glamorous facade completely destroyed. The entire atmosphere in the dining room had flipped upside down in a matter of minutes. The 30 relatives who were hurling vicious insults at me just moments ago were now frozen in pure terror. They looked at Jason with deep disgust and then looked at me with undeniable fear. The absolute power now belonged entirely to me. The silence in the room did not last long. The 30 relatives who had just spent the entire evening insulting me suddenly realized which way the wind was blowing. They saw the certified property deed and the forensic evidence of federal fraud. In the blink of an eye, the entire herd switched sides. Aunt Martha, who had just called me a disgrace, turned her furious gaze toward Jason. She pointed her finger at him and loudly called him a disgusting thief. Uncle Robert, who had praised Jason just an hour ago, slammed his fist on the table and shouted that Jason had brought unbearable shame to the entire family bloodline. The room erupted into a storm of angry voices, but this time every single curse was aimed directly at the golden boy and his greedy wife. Maya shrank back into her chair, covering her ears, as the relatives tore her fake luxury image to pieces. Jason could not handle the sudden collapse of his perfect world. His face turned bright red with pure rage. He let out a loud and desperate scream, pushing his heavy wooden chair backward. He lunged across the dining room table, reaching his hands out aggressively to grab my throat, but he never even made it halfway. The brutal reality of social power kicked in instantly. Cousin Greg and Uncle Robert, the very men who had threatened me earlier, immediately jumped into action. They tackled Jason hard against the hardwood floor. 2 other uncles rushed over and pinned his arms firmly behind his back, pressing his face against the polished wood. They were completely desperate to protect the new legal owner of the house, hoping I would forget their earlier insults. I stood perfectly still, looking down at Jason, as he struggled helplessly under their heavy weight. As Jason lay pinned against the hardwood floor, cursing and struggling under the heavy weight of our relatives, the chaotic noise in the dining room began to settle into a heavy and suffocating silence. My mother Diane finally realized that every single manipulation tactic she had ever used in her entire life was now completely useless. Her precious golden boy was exposed as a federal criminal, and her grand extortion plan had been entirely destroyed. She slowly slid off her expensive dining chair and fell to her knees right beside the large oak table. Real tears finally began to stream down her pale and wrinkled face, replacing the fake theatrical sobs from earlier in the evening. She looked up at me with wide, desperate eyes and clasped her shaking hands together in a pathetic prayer. "Caroline, please," she begged, her voice cracking with pure terror and deep desperation. "You have made your point. You have won everything, and we have lost everything. But please do not do this to us. Do not throw your own parents out into the freezing cold. I gave birth to you. I raised you and fed you. Despite everything that has happened here tonight, we are still family. We share the exact same blood. You cannot just erase that sacred blood connection." I stood incredibly tall and looked down at the pathetic woman kneeling on my polished floor. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no pity, no sadness, and certainly no guilt in my heart. The word family was just a convenient weapon they only picked up when they needed to bleed me dry. I slowly shook my head, looking at her with total disgust. "Blood does not give you the right to steal a dying man money," I said, my voice completely void of any human emotion. "Blood does not give you the right to extort my hard-earned retirement fund. And blood certainly does not give you the right to stay in my house." I reached into the dark leather bag one final time. My mother held her breath, hoping I was pulling out a tissue to dry her tears or a checkbook to save her from ruin. Instead, I pulled out a single sheet of bright yellow paper. It was not a bank statement or a property deed. It was a formal, legally binding 30-day eviction notice printed and officially stamped by the local county sheriff office. I leaned forward and pressed the bright yellow paper firmly onto the center of the dining table, right next to her trembling hands. "This is an official 30-day notice to vacate the premises I announced clearly, so every single person in the massive room could hear the absolute final verdict. You and Richard have exactly 30 days to pack your personal belongings and vacate my property. If you are not completely gone by midnight on the 30th day, the county sheriff will arrive to physically remove you and throw your belongings onto the public sidewalk. And if I find a single scratch on my walls or a single piece of missing furniture when I conduct the final inspection, I will file criminal property damage charges against both of you without a second thought. The extortion ends tonight. The free ride is permanently over. Pack your bags, Diane." I slowly turned away from my weeping mother and walked around the long oak table toward the spot where Jason was still pinned flat against the floorboards. My uncles were holding him down firmly, but his desperate struggles had already stopped. He was just lying there, panting heavily with his cheek pressed against the cold wood. Maya was sitting frozen in her expensive dining chair, entirely speechless and as pale as a ghost. I looked down at both of them with a chilling sense of absolute finality. "You really thought the forged check and the bank foreclosure were the worst things that could happen to you tonight?" I said, my voice perfectly calm and measured. Jason slowly lifted his terrified eyes to look at me, his face twisted in pure dread. "I am a forensic auditor, Jason. My entire professional career is strictly built on tracking every single penny that moves through the financial system. When I uncovered your pathetic little shell company, JM Consulting, I did not just stop at the bank statements. I dug deeply into your corporate tax returns for the past 2 entire years." I paused for a brief moment, letting the heavy silence amplify the incoming blow. "You stole $500,000 from a dying man, and then you extracted hundreds of thousands of dollars more from the equity of this house. You funneled all that stolen cash into a fake consulting firm to buy luxury electric cars and extremely expensive tropical vacations. But in your arrogant rush to live a fake wealthy lifestyle, you completely forgot one absolutely crucial detail. You never declared a single dime of that massive income to the federal government. You committed severe tax evasion on top of the federal wire fraud." Maya let out a sharp gasp and covered her mouth with both of her trembling hands. Earlier this morning, right after my legal team finalized the purchase of this house, I compiled every single piece of financial evidence into a highly encrypted digital file. I continued my tone completely devoid of any sympathy. I securely transmitted the complete dossier directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. The IRS agents already possess your bank records, your fake invoices, and the verified forensic handwriting report. They do not care about our family drama, but they absolutely destroy anyone who steals from the federal government. You are not just going to lose your luxury vehicles and your fake wealthy lifestyle. The federal agents are coming for you. You are both facing multiple federal tax evasion charges and a guaranteed lengthy prison sentence. Enjoy your final holiday meals because your freedom is officially over. Happy Thanksgiving, Jason! The massive dining room was now completely submerged in a heavy ocean of pure despair and absolute terror. My mother Diane was still kneeling on the polished hardwood floor, sobbing uncontrollably and begging the empty air for a sudden miracle that would never arrive. My father Richard remained slumped deep inside his expensive dining chair, clutching his chest and staring at the bright yellow eviction notice with completely hollow and defeated eyes. Jason was still pinned firmly against the floorboards by our own relatives crying loudly like a pathetic child who had finally been caught breaking the rules. Maya sat frozen in her seat with tears ruining her perfect makeup, entirely paralyzed by the terrifying reality of an incoming federal prison sentence. The 30 relatives who had gathered here to witness my ultimate humiliation were now aggressively shouting at each other, desperately trying to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of this massive criminal fraud. I stood perfectly still amidst the deafening chaos of the room. I slowly reached out and picked up my crystal glass from the oak table. The dark red wine perfectly reflected the bright light of the chandelier. I brought the glass to my lips and calmly drank the very last drop, savoring the sweet taste of absolute victory. I gently placed the empty glass back onto the table. I picked up my heavy leather bag and slipped the strap securely over my shoulder. I did not say another word to them. I did not look back at the pathetic ruins of the family that had tried to destroy me. I simply turned around and walked with steady and confident steps toward the front door. The desperate cries and pathetic screams faded behind me as I stepped out into the freezing night air, finally completely free. Exactly 30 days after that unforgettable Thanksgiving dinner, the heavy boots of the local county sheriff echoed on my front porch. The bright yellow eviction notice was no longer just a threat. It was a brutal reality. I sat comfortably in my parked car across the street watching the final scene unfold. A cheap moving crew was carelessly dragging my parents' belongings out the front door. I watched the sheriff officially lock the heavy wooden door and secure the property with thick metal chains. The luxurious illusion they had aggressively maintained for decades was finally reduced to a sad pile of broken cardboard boxes sitting on the cold concrete sidewalk. Jason was not even there to help them. Exactly 2 weeks after the holiday dinner, federal agents from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division raided his fake tech startup office. They dragged the golden boy out in heavy steel handcuffs right in front of his wealthy investors. Maya immediately filed for a desperate emergency divorce, hoping to detach herself from his sinking ship. She packed her expensive designer bags and quickly bought a one-way ticket to a remote tropical island. But her cowardly escape plan failed miserably. Federal authorities intercepted her right at the international airport departure gate. The forged bank checks had her legal name firmly attached to them. The government does not forgive $500,000 of stolen funds. She traded her emerald silk dress for a standard orange prison jumpsuit. With their criminal sons sitting in a federal holding cell, my parents had absolutely nowhere else to go. The 30 relatives who had attended their extravagant dinner party completely vanished into thin air. Nobody wanted to answer their frantic phone calls. Nobody wanted to lend them a single dollar. My father Richard and my mother Diane were forced to rent a tiny rundown apartment in a highly dangerous neighborhood on the absolute outskirts of the city. My father, who always acted so incredibly proud, now looked completely defeated by the world. the peeling paint on their new walls, and the constant sound of loud police sirens outside became their new, permanent reality. They tried to call my private accounting office exactly one time. My secretary simply listened to my mother desperately crying and begging for a second chance before quietly hanging up the phone and permanently blocking their number. They had spent their entire lives treating me like a disposable stepping stone. They had happily watched Jason drain the family legacy and tried to forcefully extort my retirement fund to cover up his crimes. Now they were completely isolated, sitting alone in a freezing dark room with absolutely nothing left but the bitter consequences of their toxic greed. The financial audit of my life was finally perfectly balanced. I turned the steering wheel of my car and drove away without looking back. 6 months after that chaotic holiday dinner, I sat comfortably in the living room of my brand-new penthouse apartment. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a completely unobstructed view of the deep blue waters of Lake Michigan. The morning sun reflected brightly off the gentle waves, creating a perfectly peaceful atmosphere that I had never experienced in my entire life. I held a crisp piece of paper in my right hand, resting it gently on my lap. It was not a forged check or a desperate legal notice. It was a certified bank check from a highly reputable real estate brokerage firm. After I legally evicted my parents and fully secured the property, I hired a premium contracting team to completely renovate the outdated house. We tore down the peeling wallpaper, replaced the old hardwood floors, and modernized the entire kitchen. The massive corner lot in that wealthy suburban neighborhood was highly desirable. I put the fully renovated property back on the real estate market exactly 3 months later. A wealthy young doctor and his wife fell in love with the modern upgrades and immediately offered to buy it with pure cash. They paid nearly double the amount I originally spent to rescue it from the bank foreclosure. The massive profit margin was the final and most satisfying return on my unexpected real estate investment. I slowly traced my fingers over the printed numbers on the heavy paper. The 7-figure sum represented much more than just financial wealth. It represented absolute and undeniable freedom. At 55 years old, society often expects a single woman to quietly fade into the background. My toxic family had certainly expected me to be their silent and obedient financial slave for the rest of my days. They wanted me to carry the heavy burden of their endless debts and fund their arrogant illusions of grandeur. But the heavy chains they tried to wrap around my neck were completely broken now. The parasites that had constantly drained my energy and my bank accounts were permanently removed from my existence. I took a slow sip of my freshly brewed dark roast coffee. The bitter and rich taste warmed my throat perfectly. The penthouse was incredibly quiet. There were no loud arguments about unpaid bills and no pathetic theatrical performances to manipulate my emotions. There was only the gentle hum of the central air conditioning and the beautiful sight of the sun rising over the vast lake. I had successfully audited my own life. I had identified the fraudulent liabilities and ruthlessly cut them out of my personal balance sheet. I was finally the sole and undisputed matriarch of my own destiny. The second chapter of my life was just beginning, and it was going to be absolutely brilliant. I placed the massive profit check onto the glass coffee table, smiled brightly at the endless horizon, and simply breathed in the perfect silence. Looking back at the cold waters of Lake Michigan, I realized something deeply profound. For 55 years, I was conditioned to believe that family was an absolute and unbreakable bond. Society constantly teaches us that we must forgive every single transgression and quietly endure every manipulation simply because we share the exact same DNA. But I learned the hard way that this is a very dangerous lie. Bloodline is not a license to exploit. Sharing a last name does not give anyone the right to drain your bank account, destroy your mental health, or demand your endless sacrifice. Real family is built on mutual respect and genuine care. When those crucial elements are completely missing, blood becomes nothing more than a biological coincidence. I spent decades carrying the heavy weight of their expectations. I let them make me feel small because I truly thought that was my duty as a loyal daughter. I allowed their toxic greed to dictate my emotional state. But those days are permanently over. The moment I stopped looking at them through the blurry lens of family and started looking at them through the clear lens of truth, everything changed. I audited my own life. I looked at the raw numbers and the undeniable facts, and I finally realized that I held all the power. Many of us, especially women over 50, are constantly taught that it is too late to start over. We are told that we should just keep the peace and quietly endure the disrespect so we do not end up alone. I am here to tell you today that this is absolutely false. Your 50s and beyond can be the most powerful and liberating chapter of your entire life. You have decades of wisdom, of hard-earned resilience, and of financial independence. You do not owe your peace of mind to anyone who refuses to respect your boundaries. It is a terrifying step to walk away from the people who raised you. It feels like stepping off a steep cliff in the dark. But once you take that courageous step, you realize you are not falling at all. You are finally flying. Cutting out toxic family members is the hardest decision you will ever have to make. It comes with heavy guilt, and it comes with deep grief. But on the other side of that pain is an incredible sense of permanent freedom. You deserve to wake up every single day in a peaceful home. You deserve to spend your hard-earned money on your own happiness and your own future. You deserve to be surrounded only by people who truly value you for who you are. I know I am not the only one who has had to make this incredibly difficult choice. There is an entire silent army of us out there who have reclaimed our power and rewritten our own beautiful endings. I really want to hear from you today. Go down into the comments section right now and tell me your personal story. Share how you finally stood up to the toxic people in your own life. Tell me about the exact moment you decided that your inner peace was far more important than their toxic approval. Your story could be the exact inspiration that someone else desperately needs to finally break their own chains. Leave your experiences below and let us build a strong community of independent survivors. Thank you so much for listening to my journey. Please leave a like if you found value in this story and follow this channel for more chapters of truth and empowerment.